The massive space station hung in the darkness like a metal city among the stars. Inside, alien voices filled the war room with panic and fear. Representatives from dozens of different worlds had gathered for one terrible reason. The HFY were coming, and they were unstoppable. Admiral Tejo walked quietly into the chamber, his boots echoing on the cold metal floor. Behind him came his small team from the human warship Resilient. The other aliens barely looked their way. To them, humans were still newcomers to the galaxy, barely worth noticing. The holographic display in the center of the room showed a horrifying sight. 3 entire star systems had gone dark. 17 billion lives gone without a trace. The HFY swarm moved like a plague across space, consuming everything in their path. They hit the Rigel colonies 3 days ago, announced the tall Centaurian delegate, his blue skin pale with worry. Our scouts report nothing left but empty space. No debris, no survivors, nothing. A shiver ran through the assembled crowd. These weren't just military targets the enemy had destroyed. These were homes, families, entire civilizations wiped out as if they had never existed. The HFY didn't just kill, they erased. Admiral Tejo stepped forward when his turn came, to present humanity's contribution to the defense. The room fell silent, but not from respect. Lieutenant Commander Yunji noticed the smirks on alien faces as they looked at the datapad showing their ship's specifications. The Resilient was old, that much was true. Her hull bore the scars of countless patrol missions along humanity's frontier. Her weapons were simple by galactic standards, no quantum torpedoes or plasma cannons, just good old-fashioned projectile weapons and basic energy beams. To these advanced alien civilizations, she looked like a museum piece. This is humanity's great contribution? The Altarian fleet commander's voice dripped with disdain. His species had been traveling the stars for thousands of years, while humans were still figuring out fire. A cargo hauler with delusions of military service? Laughter rippled through parts of the assembly. Not cruel laughter, but the kind you might hear when a child offers to help move furniture. Condescending, dismissive, the kind that cut deeper than any insult. Tejo felt his jaw clench, but years of military discipline kept his voice steady. The Resilient has served with distinction for 15 years. Her crew knows their duty. I'm sure they do, replied the fleet commander with a wave of his hand that made it clear the conversation was over. You'll be assigned to evacuation duty. Help move the civilians to safety while the real warships handle the fighting. Captain Somin, standing beside her admiral, felt her hands ball into fists. The real warships, as if their ship and crew were just playing pretend. But she bit her tongue and stayed silent. This wasn't the time or place for pride. The battle plans unfolded on the holographic display like a complex dance. Massive dreadnoughts would form the main battle line. Cruiser squadrons would provide support fire. Fighter wings would harass enemy flanks. And there, relegated to the very back of the formation, sat the lonely icon representing the Resilient. Engineer Da-hoon leaned over to Chief Navigator Hyun-woo and whispered, "They've got us babysitting the refugee ships while they play hero." "Maybe that's for the best," Hyun-woo replied quietly. "Someone needs to make sure those people get out alive." But both men knew it stung. Every human in that room had grown up hearing stories about their ancestors fighting impossible odds. They came from a species that had clawed its way to the stars through sheer stubborn determination. Now they were being patted on the head and sent to the corner, while the adults handled the serious business. As the meeting broke up and the various species returned to their fleets, Admiral Tejo gathered his officers in a quiet corridor. The weight of what was coming pressed down on all of them like gravity from a massive planet. "They think we don't belong here," said Lieutenant Commander Yunji, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe they're right," replied Communications Officer Min Seo. "Look at their ships, their weapons. We're bringing a slingshot to a laser fight." Tejo looked at each of his officers in turn. These were good people, brave people who had volunteered to stand between their homes and an enemy that had never known defeat. They deserved better than to be dismissed and forgotten. "Let me tell you something about slingshots," he said finally. "A shepherd boy once used one to drop a giant that armies couldn't touch. Sometimes it's not about the size of your weapon. Sometimes it's about the heart of the person holding it." The klaxons began to sound throughout the station. Fleet commanders were calling their ships to battle stations. Across the galaxy, the largest military force in known history was preparing to make its stand. But in that quiet corridor, 6 humans stood together and made their own quiet promise. They might be overlooked and underestimated, but they would not be found wanting when the moment came to prove their worth. The Kepler system had become a graveyard of dreams and twisted metal. What started as the galaxy's greatest stand against the HFY had turned into a massacre that would be remembered for generations. Captain So-min stood on the bridge of the Resilient, watching the battle unfold on her screens with growing horror. The Coalition's mighty dreadnoughts, ships the size of small cities, burned like candles in the void. These weren't just any vessels being destroyed. These were the pride of entire civilizations. The Altarian flagship Eternal Glory, which had dismissed humanity just hours before, now tumbled helplessly through space with half its hull missing. "Captain, the Centaurian battle group is taking heavy casualties," reported Chief Navigator Hyunwoo, his voice tight with disbelief. "Their quantum shields aren't even slowing the enemy down." So-min watched as another massive warship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. Inside that ship had been thousands of crew members, people with families and dreams, now reduced to glowing particles drifting in space. The HFY weapons seemed to cut through even the most advanced defenses, like they were made of paper. Lieutenant Woo Jin, barely 25 and fresh from the academy, stared at his sensor readings with wide eyes. "Ma'am, their adaptive shielding is learning from every attack. Every time our forces hit them with something, they become immune to it within minutes. The enemy wasn't just winning, they were evolving during the battle itself. Each coalition weapon that struck a HFY vessel made the entire swarm stronger. It was like fighting an opponent who became invincible every time you landed a punch. From their position in the evacuation zone, the crew of the Resilient could only watch as ship after ship fell. These weren't random vessels being destroyed. These were the flagships of entire star nations, the pride of the Rigelian Deep Space Fleet, the crown jewel of the Andromedan Defense Force. One by one, they all met the same fate. "Sir, I'm picking up retreat orders from Fleet Command," Communications Officer Min Seo announced, her voice barely steady. The defeat in her tone said everything. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever assembled was running for their lives. Admiral Tae-ho stood in the center of the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the command rail. Behind them, thousands of civilian transports crawled toward the hyperspace lanes at agonizingly slow speeds. Refugee ships packed with families, children, elderly, all the people who couldn't fight but still deserved to live. The math was simple and brutal. At their current speed, the civilians would never reach safety before the HFY caught up. Someone needed to buy them time, and the retreating coalition forces weren't going to stick around to do it. Engineer Da-hoon burst onto the bridge, sweat beading on his forehead. "Admiral, the refugee convoy is moving too slowly. Those cargo haulers weren't built for speed, and some of them are breaking down under the strain." Through the view screen, they could see the truth of his words. Ancient freighters struggling, to keep up, their engines glowing red from overexertion. Family transports designed for short hops between planets, now pushed far beyond their limits. If just one of them broke down completely, it would slow the entire convoy. "How long until the HFY reach them?" Tae-ho asked quietly. Hyunwoo ran the calculations twice before answering. "At current speeds, maybe 2 hours. The convoy needs at least 4 to reach the hyperspace lanes." The bridge fell silent. Everyone understood what those numbers meant. 2 million civilians were going to die unless someone slowed down the enemy advance. The retreating coalition fleets were already jumping to hyperspace, carrying news of their defeat to distant worlds. Captain So-min looked at her admiral, seeing the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. These weren't abstract numbers. They were discussing. These were real people. Mothers holding babies, children clutching toy ships, elderly couples who had survived wars and famines, only to face extinction in the cold of space. "Sir," she said softly, "we could make a difference. One ship, striking at the right moment, might disrupt their formation long enough for the convoy to escape." Lieutenant Commander Eun-ji stepped forward. "The Resilient may not be much compared to their dreadnoughts, but we're fast and maneuverable. We could hit them where they don't expect it. The Admiral looked around at his crew, 200 souls who had volunteered to serve, knowing full well that military service sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice. These weren't career soldiers looking for glory. They were ordinary people who had chosen to stand between their homes and the darkness. "All hands, this is the Admiral," Tejo announced over the ship's intercom, his voice carrying to every corner of the vessel. "We have new orders. We're going in." The response was immediate. From the engine room to the weapons bay, from the medical deck to the communications center, the crew of the Resilient acknowledged their commander's decision. They understood what he was asking of them, and they answered without hesitation as the ship began to turn toward the advancing enemy. Dahun spoke what everyone was thinking. "They called us a cargo hauler with delusions. Let's show them what delusions can accomplish." The Resilient accelerated into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of the evacuation zone. Behind them, 2 million civilians continued their desperate flight toward freedom, unaware that their lives now depended on a ship that the galaxy had dismissed as worthless. The Resilient dove into the heart of the battle like a small fish swimming into a school of sharks. Around them, the wreckage of the galaxy's finest warships drifted in the void, twisted metal monuments to a failed defense. But Captain Somin wasn't looking at the destruction. She was looking for opportunities. "Port batteries, target there." "Sensor array on the lead vessel," she ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos on the bridge. The Vex-High ships moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with an alien beauty that masked their deadly purpose. "Weapons Officer Jinne, I want you to forget everything the manual says about proper targeting." Jinne looked up from her console with confusion. "Ma'am?" "The manual was written by people who never fought these things," Somin explained as enemy. Fire lit up the space around them. "They expect us to follow the rules, so we won't." This was the difference the alien commanders had failed to understand. Human military doctrine hadn't evolved from a position of technological superiority. For centuries, humans had been the underdogs, fighting enemies with better weapons, better armor, better everything. They had learned to survive by being unpredictable. Resilient rolled suddenly to starboard, using the burning hulk of a Centaurian cruiser as cover. The movement was so unexpected that the Vex-High targeting systems lost their lock for precious seconds. In that brief window, Jinne's weapons found their mark, sending a spread of projectiles into the enemy sensor cluster. "Direct hit," shouted Lieutenant Wu Jin from his post. "Their formation is wavering." But the real genius of the human approach wasn't in any single attack. It was in their refusal to give up on their fallen allies. While the Vex-High expected defeated ships to be abandoned, the humans saw them as potential resources. "Navigator Hyunwoo, bring us alongside the damaged Altarian vessel," ordered Admiral Tejo. The same ship whose commander had mocked them hours earlier now drifted powerless, its crew trapped and helpless. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Altarian ship," reported Minseo. "They're asking for evacuation assistance." "Tell them we have a better idea," Tejo replied with a grim smile. "Ask if their weapon systems are still functional." Within minutes, Engineer Dahun had jury-rigged a communications link between the two ships. The Altarian crew, amazed to find themselves still alive, quickly agreed to the human plan. Their massive plasma cannons might not be able to move, but they could still shoot. The Resilient became the eyes and coordination center for 3 damaged coalition vessels, creating an impromptu battle group from what should have been space debris. It was messy, improvised, and completely contrary to established military doctrine. The Vex-High quantum computers, designed to analyze and counter logical tactical patterns, found themselves baffled. "Enemy formation is breaking up," reported Wu Jin with excitement. "They're trying to adapt to our attack pattern, but they can't figure out what our attack pattern is." That was because there wasn't one, at least not in any way the alien machines could understand. The humans were making it up as they went along, responding to each moment with whatever seemed like it might work. Sometimes they used damaged ships as weapons platforms. Sometimes they used debris fields as cover. Sometimes they just did something completely random to confuse the enemy sensors. Communications Officer Min Seo coordinated between 4 different species, translating not just languages, but tactical concepts on the fly. "The Regellian captain wants to know if we can use his ship's gravity generators as a weapon," she reported. "Can we?" asked Somin. Dahoon's eyes lit up. "If we overload them at the right moment, we could create a gravity well that pulls the enemy ships together, make them easier targets." It was insane. It was impossible. It violated about 15 different safety protocols, so naturally they tried it. The gravity pulse sent 3 Vex-high vessels crashing into each other in a tangle of metal and energy. For the first time since the battle began, the enemy formation showed signs of genuine confusion. Their perfect algorithms had no response for tactics that bordered on suicidal creativity. Lieutenant Commander Yunji watched the enemy ships trying to untangle themselves and shook her head in amazement. "They're so focused on efficiency that they can't handle chaos. That's their weakness," realized Teho. "They've never fought anyone crazy enough to use a gravity generator as a weapon." The Resilient continued to weave through the battlefield, turning disaster into opportunity at every turn. When a coalition ammunition ship exploded, they used the blast to mask their approach. When enemy fire damaged their port weapons, they rolled the ship to bring the starboard batteries to bear. Every problem became a chance to try something new, but it wasn't just creativity that kept them alive. It was something deeper. The Vex-high fought with cold perfection, each ship a component in a vast machine. The humans fought with passion, each crew member connected to something larger than themselves. They weren't just following orders. They were protecting their homes, their families, their future. "Captain," called out Jinei from the weapons station, "I'm reading massive enemy reinforcements incoming. We've got maybe 10 minutes before. They overwhelm us completely." Somin looked around at her crew, seeing determination mixed with exhaustion on every face. They had proven their point, shown the galaxy that humans belonged in this fight, but the math was still against them. One ship, no matter how clever, couldn't hold off an entire swarm forever. It was time to make their final stand count for something more than just pride. Chief Engineer Dahoon stumbled onto the bridge, his uniform blackened with soot and small burn marks dotting his sleeves. Behind him, the ship groaned under another devastating hit from Vex-high energy weapons. Sparks flew from overloaded circuits, and the lights flickered as the Resilient fought to stay alive. "Admiral," Dahoon gasped, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." The entire bridge crew turned to look at him. In the background, alarms continued their urgent wailing, and the ship shuddered, again as another enemy blast found its mark. Through the view screen, they could see the massive Vex-high command vessel looming like a metal mountain, its surface bristling with weapons that could vaporize planets. Dahoon pulled up a holographic display of the ship's reactor core, his hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Our fusion reactor wasn't designed for this kind of combat stress. The containment fields are already starting to fluctuate." "Get to the point, engineer," urged Captain Somin as sparks rained down from a damaged console nearby. "We can overload." "It," Dahoon said quietly. "Push the reactor past its safety limits and create an electromagnetic pulse. The energy release would be massive, enough to disrupt their quantum networks across the entire enemy fleet." Admiral Teho studied the display, understanding immediately what his engineer wasn't saying out loud. "What's the catch?" Dahoon met his admiral's eyes. "There is no safety protocol for this. Once we start the overload sequence, we can't stop it. The ship won't survive the energy release." The bridge fell silent, except for the distant sound of damage control teams working frantically throughout the vessel. Everyone understood what Dahoon was proposing. It wasn't just a desperate tactic, it was a suicide mission. Lieutenant Commander Yunji was the first to speak. "How long would the electromagnetic pulse last?" "Maybe 40 to 50 seconds, Dahoon replied. "Long enough to knock out their adaptive systems and give the coalition fleet a chance to regroup and counterattack." Communications Officer Minseo looked up from her console with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I'm still receiving distress calls from civilian transports. They're not all clear yet." The weight of the decision pressed down on everyone. They could save themselves, retreat with the rest of the coalition forces, and live to fight another day. Or they could make a stand that might turn the tide of the entire war, knowing they would never see the outcome. Admiral Teho straightened his shoulders and looked around at his crew. These weren't just military personnel. They were people with families waiting at home, dreams left unfulfilled, lives barely begun. The youngest crew member was 19. The oldest was 62. Each one had a story, a reason for being here. "The crew needs to know what we're asking of them," Tejo said quietly to his officers. "This isn't a decision we can make for them." Within 10 minutes, every person on the Resilient had been informed of the plan. From the newest recruit in the galley to the most experienced petty officer in engineering, everyone understood the choice before them. They could try to escape, or they could give their lives to protect millions of others. The vote wasn't even close. It was unanimous. As the Resilient changed course toward the massive Vex-High command vessel, the crew began their final preparations. In the engine room, Da-Hoon and his team worked to modify the reactor controls. On the bridge, Navigator Hyun-Woo plotted their approach vector with mathematical precision. In the weapons bay, Jin-Ae armed every remaining missile and torpedo they had left. But it was Min-Seo who provided the moment that would be remembered long after the battle ended. "Admiral," she said, her voice steady despite everything, "I'd like to open all communication frequencies." "What for?" asked Captain So-min. Min-Seo smiled through her tears. "If we're going out, let's remind the galaxy what they're fighting for." The sounds of Earth began to flow across every communication channel in the battle zone. Ancient war songs that had inspired soldiers for centuries, the laughter of children playing in parks under blue skies, the voices of poets reading words about hope and courage, music from every culture and continent, carrying the dreams of an entire species. The Vex-High, with their cold efficiency and perfect logic, had never encountered anything like it. They had fought countless battles, conquered numerous worlds, but they had never faced an enemy that sang while charging to their death. Lieutenant Wu Jin monitored the enemy response from his station. "Sir, their formation is wavering. I think the broadcast is confusing their tactical algorithms." "Good," whispered Captain So-min as she watched the enemy flagship grow larger on the viewscreen. "Let them be confused." The Resilient accelerated toward its destiny, a small flame against the darkness of space. Behind them, the retreating coalition forces began to receive the tactical data the human crew had gathered during their improvised battle. Every weakness they had discovered, every pattern they had identified, every countermeasure they had developed was being transmitted in real time. In the engine room, Da-Hoon placed his hand on the reactor control panel. "For everyone who can't, fight back," he said, echoing the captain's earlier words. The fusion reactor began to sing with deadly energy, building toward a crescendo that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. The Resilient, dismissed as worthless just hours before, was about to prove that sometimes the smallest light can illuminate the darkest night. The electromagnetic pulse from the Resilient's sacrifice rippled across space like an invisible tsunami, washing over the Vex-High fleet in a wave of pure energy. For exactly 47 seconds, something impossible happened. The enemy's perfect quantum networks went completely silent. Admiral Kang Min of the retreating coalition forces watched from his command ship as every Vex-High vessel suddenly stopped moving. Their adaptive shields flickered and died, their weapons powered down. For the first time since the invasion began, the unstoppable alien swarm looked vulnerable. "All ships, emergency stop," Kang Min broadcast to his fleeing fleet. Something's happened to the enemy formation. On dozens of coalition vessels, crew members stared at their sensors in disbelief. The Vex-High ships that had been slaughtering them just minutes before now drifted helplessly in space. Their hulls, which had seemed invincible, showed no energy, signatures at all. But the real miracle wasn't the 47 seconds of enemy confusion. It was what the crew of the Resilient had transmitted during their final moments. Chief Communications Officer Park Ji-won of the Coalition flagship began receiving data packets that would change everything. "Sir," she announced with growing excitement, "we're getting detailed tactical information from the human vessel. Battle, patterns, weapon effectiveness ratings, behavioral analysis of enemy formations. They documented everything during their engagement. The information flooding their systems wasn't just random observations. It was a complete tactical manual written in blood and sacrifice by a crew that knew they were going to die." Every weakness the humans had discovered, every successful attack pattern they had used, every flaw in the Vexhi's seemingly perfect strategy. Lieutenant Commander Yun Hai Jin, the Coalition's chief tactical officer, studied the incoming data with amazement. They found patterns in the enemy's adaptive behavior. Look at this. The Vexhi systems take approximately 12 seconds to analyze and counter any new attack method. But if you hit them with multiple different attacks in rapid sequence, they can't adapt fast enough, finished Admiral Kang Min, understanding immediately. They get overwhelmed trying to counter everything at once. The 47 seconds were almost over. Across the Vexhi fleet, quantum computers began rebooting, systems came back online, and the terrible efficiency of their war machine started to return. But something had fundamentally changed in those precious moments of silence. All Coalition vessels, Admiral Kang Min broadcast on all frequencies, we have new intelligence. The humans have given us the key to victory. All ships prepare for coordinated assault pattern Alpha 7. The retreating Coalition fleet turned as one, their engines blazing with renewed purpose. But this time they weren't fighting blind. They had a plan based on hard-won knowledge and paid for with human lives. The first wave of attacks hit the Vexhi formation like a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Centaurian plasma cannons fired in rapid bursts, switching between different energy frequencies every few seconds. Alterian quantum torpedoes used randomized targeting patterns that changed mid-flight. Rigelian fighters employed erratic flight, paths that made no tactical sense but somehow worked. Commander Seo Dong-hyun, piloting a Coalition fighter squadron, watched his targeting computer as it cycled through the attack patterns the humans had developed. "This is insane," he muttered to his wingman. "We're basically throwing everything at them and hoping something sticks." "It's working, though," his wingman replied, as another Vexhi vessel exploded in a brilliant flash. "Look at their formation. They can't keep up with all the different attacks." The Vexhi, encountering true unpredictability for the first time in their existence, found their perfect algorithms failing. Their quantum computers, designed to find logical patterns and counter them efficiently, couldn't process the seemingly random human approach to warfare that the Coalition had adopted. On the bridge of the Coalition flagship, tactical displays showed something that hadn't been seen since the war began. Vexhi ships being destroyed faster than they could adapt. The enemy's greatest strength, their ability to learn and counter any attack, had become a weakness when faced with opponents who refused to follow any logical pattern. But the real victory went deeper than just tactical success. As news of the Item battle spread across Coalition communication networks, something remarkable happened. The story of the resilient sacrifice began to inspire others. Captain Lee Min-ho of the Andromedan Defense Force found himself thinking about the human crew as he led his ships into battle. "They didn't have the biggest guns or the strongest shields," he told his crew over the intercom, "but they had something our enemy will never understand. They cared more about protecting others than protecting themselves." The battle raged for 6 more hours, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Each time the Vexhi adapted to one attack pattern, the Coalition forces switched to another method from the human tactical manual. The enemy, faced with constantly changing threats they couldn't predict or counter, began to retreat for the first time in their history. When the last Vexhi vessel disappeared into hyperspace, the Kepler system fell silent, except for the rescue operations beginning across the battlefield. Memorial beacons were placed where the Resilient had made its final stand, their lights visible from every ship in the Coalition fleet. Admiral Kang Min stood before the assembled fleet commanders in the aftermath, holding a data pad containing the complete tactical analysis the human crew had died to provide. "They gave us more than just battle plans," he said quietly. "They showed us that victory isn't about having the best technology or the strongest weapons. It's about refusing to give up, even when the odds seem impossible." The galaxy had learned a lesson written in stardust and courage. Never underestimate the species that turns impossible odds into merely improbable ones. The human spirit, it seemed, was the one variable no quantum computer could ever calculate. In the end, it wasn't the size of their ship or the power of their weapons that saved the galaxy. It was something far more dangerous to any enemy: the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when everything they loved was on the line.